In the quiet heart of a small mountain town, a little girl suddenly stopped and asked, "Daddy, can I buy that dog?" Her innocent question pulled a buried truth into the open. The trembling K-9 chained to a lamppost wasn't just another abandoned animal. It was the partner the officer believed had died in a mysterious explosion. And when the dog lifted his weary eyes toward him, it carried the one secret someone was desperate to erase forever. Kan op marid dan naobam shandbind. Chamnil wat poranusti. The late afternoon sun washed over Maple Ridge's main square, turning the stone walkway into a warm, shimmering path. Deputy Chris Walker held his daughter's hand loosely as she hopped along the cracks, humming a tune that only a 7-year-old could invent. It was one of those quiet moments he wished would last a little longer. They had just left the ice cream stand by the fountain, Lily still licking the final trace of strawberry from her thumb. Chris breathed in the cool mountain air, ready to enjoy the rare peace that came between long shifts. But peace seemed allergic to his life, and it didn't last 5 steps before Lily suddenly stopped. Her hand tightened around his fingers enough to pull him out of his drifting thoughts. She wasn't humming anymore. She wasn't even smiling. Her little brows lifted in confusion, or maybe worry, as she stared toward the busy sidewalk ahead. "Daddy," she whispered, almost like she was afraid to break something fragile in the air. "Can I buy that dog?" Chris blinked, expecting her to be pointing at someone's fluffy pet, or maybe a booth selling plush toys. But the way her voice trembled made him uneasy. He followed her gaze across the square, past the tree line, past the families heading to dinner. Then he saw it, and the ground under him seemed to tilt. A Belgian Malinois sat chained to a cold metal lamppost, its fur mottled with dirt and patches of rough, uneven hair. The dog's ribs showed through the thin coat, and one hind leg shook uncontrollably every few seconds. Just beneath its chin, a cracked cardboard sign hung from frayed tape. The sloppy black letters stabbed straight through Chris's chest. $3, retired K-9, not needed anymore. People passed the dog without slowing, sliding by with distracted eyes and shopping bags. A pair of teenagers snickered, tossing a chip toward its paws. The dog flinched, but didn't move away. It just kept staring down at the pavement as if bracing for the next small cruelty. Something about that stillness felt wrong, unnatural for a working dog. Lily let go of her father's hand and stepped forward before he could react. Her boots scraped softly against the stones as she knelt a safe distance from the trembling Malinois. She didn't speak at first. She just watched him, eyes wide and gentle, as though trying to understand a hurt she couldn't name yet. Chris felt his throat tighten, more from worry about her approach than the scene itself. He started toward her, the instinctive police caution kicking in. But the moment he moved, the dog lifted its head, slowly, painfully, and its eyes met his. The world around Chris narrowed to a pinpoint. That face, that scar under the left eye, the ear folded from an old close-quarters hit. His breath caught so sharply he had to plant his feet to steady himself. He knew that dog. The realization slammed into him so hard he stumbled back half a step. The noise of the square thinned out, replaced by the hard thud of his heartbeat. This couldn't be right. That dog was gone. That dog had died in an explosion 9 months ago. He had seen the report himself, had mourned it quietly in the break room where no one asked questions and no one offered comfort. But the Malinois didn't look away. It studied Chris with tired, confused eyes, like it was searching the dustiest corners of memory for a name it once knew. Lily glanced over her shoulder, sensing something shifting between her father and the shaking animal. "Daddy, why do you look scared?" Her voice was soft, and it hit him harder than the scar ever could. Chris didn't answer. He couldn't. All he managed was a slow inhale, the kind someone takes right before choosing between running toward danger or pretending it isn't there. He crouched a few feet from Lily, studying the dog's every twitch. Its chest rose unevenly. The chain around its neck was pulled far too tight. But it didn't growl, didn't even stiffen. It only watched him with a kind of weary acceptance. A breeze drifted through the square, lifting the corners of the cardboard sign, revealing dirt smudges and old splatters he didn't want to think about. Lily leaned in just enough to be gentle, offering her coat to cover the dog's trembling side. The Malinois blinked slowly, its head lowering toward her tiny gesture of kindness. Even in its broken state, it tried to inch closer. Chris felt the sting behind his eyes long before he admitted it to himself. There was no mistaking it now, no denying the truth clawing its way back from the past. He swallowed hard as a quiet ache bloomed in his chest. "Stay close to me, sweetheart," he said, voice barely steady. "This dog, he shouldn't be here." And somewhere in that fragile space between a father's fear and a child's compassion, the truth began to rise. The dog hadn't been abandoned by accident. It hadn't appeared here by coincidence. Something darker was threading its way back into Chris Walker's life, and it started with a K-9 staring up at him like a ghost that refused to stay buried. For a long moment, Chris didn't move. He stayed crouched where he was, watching the Malinois with a careful, almost frightened stillness. The dog held his gaze as if hoping the man in front of him would remember something long buried. The rest of the square faded into a dull hum behind them. Lily shifted closer, her small frame blocking part of the harsh evening light from hitting the dog's eyes. She whispered something soft, something only children know how to say without overthinking it, and the Malinois tried to lift his head in response. The effort alone made his body tremble. Chris swallowed, fighting a knot of disbelief rising in his chest. The scar, the ear, the way the dog leaned slightly to one side, it all lined up with the memory he'd forced himself to tuck away. He told himself this couldn't be Blaze, couldn't be the partner he had mourned. But reason was losing the fight to recognition. He leaned in, close enough to see grime caked along the dog's muzzle, close enough to see where the fur had thinned from stress. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, a quiet, hesitant breath left him, almost like an exhale of relief. The kind of sound animals make when they finally see someone familiar after too long alone. Lily looked back at her father, searching his face for answers he wasn't ready to say out loud. "Daddy, does he know you?" she asked, her voice caught somewhere between wonder and concern. Chris didn't answer, but the tension in his jaw gave her all the confirmation she needed. A passing car horn snapped the dog's attention toward the street, and his body tightened with instinctive fear. Not the alert, disciplined tension of a trained K-9, but the flinch of an animal that had been pushed too far, too often. Chris's stomach dropped at the sight. Blaze had never feared noise, never hesitated under pressure. Chris reached out, slowly, letting the dog see his hand before it got close. The Malinois lowered his head and sniffed the air, searching for a memory hidden beneath dirt and exhaustion. Then, with a tiny tremor, he leaned forward just enough to touch Chris's fingers with the edge of his nose. It was brief, fragile, but it shattered the last of Chris's denial. "That's impossible," he whispered under his breath, unsure whether he was talking to himself or the ghost of the partner he thought he'd lost. The dog's eyes softened at the sound of his voice. For a second, the square felt painfully still, as if the world was holding its breath with them. A breeze carried the faint rattle of the metal chain scraping against the pole, and Chris's attention snapped to the collar. It was too tight, worn down in places that didn't match normal use. Something about it made the hair on the back of his neck rise. He slid 2 fingers under the torn fabric, feeling for a tag that shouldn't exist. His fingertips brushed something etched inside. Numbers, scratched down so roughly they were nearly unreadable. Lily watched him closely as his expression darkened, shifting from recognition to deepening suspicion. Whatever was stamped inside that collar didn't belong on a retired K-9, and it certainly didn't belong on Blaze. The dog shivered again, a low whine slipping out as if he were apologizing for something he couldn't control. Lily instinctively placed her hand on the side of his neck, whispering one more reassurance that he wasn't alone. Chris watched the small connection between them, something steady and gentle in a place filled with questions. Another group of people walked by, making barely a glance toward the scene, as though a suffering K-9 was just part of the scenery. Chris felt a quiet anger rise. This dog had once pulled victims from collapsed buildings, had chased suspects through the freezing dark, had saved more lives than most officers saw in a career. He knelt down fully, leveling his eyes with the dog's. "If you're really Blaze," he murmured, "someone put you through hell." The Malinois blinked, and Chris swore something flickered behind that tired gaze, a faint trace of the fighter Blaze used to be, buried under exhaustion and fear. Lily gently draped her coat over the dog's shoulders. The fabric slipped unevenly, but Blaze didn't resist. He leaned into the warmth like he had been waiting hours, maybe days, for someone to offer simple kindness. Chris exhaled slowly as he watched, the weight of truth settling heavy on his chest. Whatever happened to Blaze, it hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been a mistake. Someone had chained a trained K-9 in the middle of town, with injuries no animal should carry alone. And whether Chris was ready for it or not, the past he'd tried so hard to bury had found its way back to him, one trembling breath at a time. The square had begun to thin out as early evening rolled across Maple Ridge, but the uneasy stillness around the chained K-9 only grew heavier. Chris stood in front of Blaze, trying to steady his breath when the low rumble of an engine drifted across the plaza. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a warning. A black SUV eased to a stop near the curb, its windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever was inside. Lily instinctively stepped closer to Blaze, resting one hand on his shoulder beneath her coat. The Malinois didn't lift his head, but Chris noticed the way his ears twitched sharply at the sound. It wasn't curiosity. It was fear. The driver's door opened slowly, almost too carefully, and a woman stepped out. She wore a neatly pressed field jacket, her hair pulled back tight, her steps measured. Chris recognized her immediately, and the recognition hit like a cold splash. Agent Marissa Cole, Federal Task Force, a woman who had no business showing up here. Marissa approached with a stiff, uncertain calm, her eyes locked onto Blaze. For a split second, her controlled expression cracked. Her breath caught. Her posture faltered. It was the kind of reaction someone has when they see a ghost they buried themselves. Lily looked between them, sensing the shift without understanding it. Chris moved slightly, positioning himself between Marissa and the dog. "What are you doing here?" he asked, keeping his voice low, steady, even though his stomach had dropped. Marissa didn't answer. She didn't even look at him. Her gaze stayed glued to Blaze, as if everything else around her had blurred into nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin, barely aligned with the woman he remembered. That can't be him." The way she said it made Chris's skin tighten, not with surprise, but with dread. She wasn't reacting like someone relieved a missing asset had survived. She reacted like someone whose plans had just fallen apart. Blaze shifted uneasily at the sound of her voice, pushing his weight closer to Lily. The girl's hand trembled as she whispered, "It's okay, buddy." Chris watched the dog's reaction closely. Blaze wasn't confused. He wasn't curious. He was afraid of her. And fear didn't come naturally to a trained K-9 unless something terrible had been done to him. Marissa took a small step forward, and Blaze's body tensed hard enough to rattle the chain. His breath hitched and his injured leg shook violently. Chris raised a hand, stopping her where she stood. "You need to tell me what you know." His voice stayed measured, though frustration burned under the surface. For the first time, Marissa met his eyes. There was guilt in hers and something darker, like she'd been bracing for this moment far longer than he had. "Walker, if that really is Blaze," she said quietly, "then something went very wrong, and I'm not supposed to be anywhere near him right now." Her admission made the hair on Chris's arms rise. Before Chris could push further, a voice rasped from behind a stack of crates by the fountain. An older man stepped out, gray beard, weathered coat, eyes sharp despite rough edges. A local drifter Chris had seen around town for years. He nodded toward the dog. "Saw 'em drop him off this morning. 2 men. Didn't want nobody watching." Chris turned to him, pulse tightening. "Did you see their faces?" The man shook his head slowly. "Just heard one say they'd done their part. Didn't look like folks doing charity." His gaze drifted to Blaze with unexpected softness. "Dog tried to stand when they left. Couldn't?" Lily kept her hand steady on Blaze's fur, her eyes lifting to her father. "Daddy? They hurt him?" The simple truth in her voice cut sharper than accusation. Marissa looked away, jaw tightening, like she couldn't bear the implication. Chris knew then she wasn't lying about being afraid to be here. She was hiding something that put them all in danger. The last of the daylight slipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the square. Blaze lowered his head again, exhausted, but his gaze stayed fixed on Marissa with a flicker of recognition that held no trust. Chris exhaled deeply, knowing this was only the start. Whatever had happened to Blaze didn't end with cruelty or abandonment. As Chris rose to his feet, he placed a steady hand on Lily's shoulder. "We're not leaving him," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Blaze's chest rose in a slow, trembling breath, as if he understood. But the tremor in his body was growing, not fading. And somewhere deep inside, Chris felt a cold certainty forming. Blaze hadn't just survived something horrible. He had escaped something much worse, and whatever it was, it had followed him all the way here. The square's lights flickered on, one by one, casting long amber streaks across the pavement. For a brief moment, it almost looked peaceful again, as if the town wanted to pretend nothing strange was happening. But Blaze's breathing had grown uneven, each inhale thinner than the last, and the tension in Chris's chest deepened. Lily stayed kneeling beside the Malinois, brushing her fingers gently through the rough patches of fur. Her small voice carried across the quiet square, soft and steady, trying to comfort a dog who no longer had the strength to lift his head. Blaze leaned against her touch, but even that simple motion sent a shiver through his frame. Chris watched carefully, noticing how Blaze's hind leg gave out each time he tried to shift his weight. He had seen injured K-9s before, seen them after explosions, chases, long nights in the snow. But this was different. This was the exhaustion of something drawn out, something cruel that had been happening for far too long. Marissa stood a few steps back, arms folded tight, her eyes darting across the street like she expected someone else to arrive. Her breathing was shallow, and for the first time since she stepped out of the SUV, she looked afraid. Not of Chris, not of Lily, but of whatever had led Blaze here in the first place. Before Chris could question her again, Blaze jerked suddenly, his front paws slipping out from beneath him. The chain rattled sharply against the pole as his entire body seized in a violent tremor. Lily gasped, reaching out instinctively to steady him, but the dog collapsed onto his side with a broken, painful whine that cut straight through the night air. Chris lunged forward just in time to keep Blaze's head from hitting the stone walkway. The Malinois lay limp in his arms, his breath stuttering in shallow bursts, each one weaker than the last. Chris felt the heat radiating from the dog's body. Too warm in some places, too cold in others. Something was failing inside him. "Daddy, he's not breathing right," Lily whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. She knelt close, her hands hovering helplessly over Blaze's flank. The dog's chest rose again, but barely, like the air had to fight its way back out. Chris steadied himself, forcing calm into his voice even as dread crept into his bones. He slid his arm under Blaze's shoulders, lifting the dog carefully. Blaze was lighter than Chris remembered, far too light for a fully trained Malinois. The realization made his stomach sink. A healthy K-9 didn't lose weight like this unless he had been starved, neglected, or denied proper care for a long time. Marissa stepped forward, but Chris shot her a look that stopped her cold. "If you know something, you say it now," he said, his voice low but shaking with urgency. Marissa swallowed, unable to answer, unable to meet his eyes. Blaze trembled again, pressing his nose weakly against Chris's arm, as though searching for a memory he could still trust. Lily wiped her cheeks with the back of her sleeve and stood, her voice trembling but determined. "Daddy, we have to take him. Now." There was no hesitation, no fear, only the simple clarity children carry when they see something broken that needs saving. Chris nodded, shifting Blaze into his arms and rising carefully to his feet. Blaze let out a faint, ragged exhale as his head rested against Chris's shoulder. His eyes fluttered half open, unfocused, following Lily's small silhouette as she ran ahead toward the parked truck. For a moment, his tail twitched, weak and slow, but unmistakably toward her. Even through the pain, he knew she was safety. Chris hurried across the square, feeling Blaze's heartbeat faltering against his chest. Each step felt heavier than the last. The hum of the town blurred into the background, leaving only the sound of his boots striking the pavement and Lily fumbling desperately with the truck's back door. The fear in the air was sharp, real, impossible to ignore. He lowered Blaze onto the back seat with care, folding Lily's coat beneath the dog's head as a cushion. Blaze's eyes fluttered again, but exhaustion pulled them closed almost immediately. Lily climbed in beside him, her hands gently framing his muzzle. "You're okay," she whispered through shaking breaths. "We're not leaving you." As Chris slammed the driver's door shut and started the engine, he caught one last glimpse of Marissa standing alone in the square. Her face was pale, her expression stricken, like she knew exactly what Blaze was running from, and feared they might already be too late. Yum-de-yum. The emergency clinic sat on the edge of town, its dim porch light flickering against the cold night air. As Chris carried Blaze through the glass doors, the world felt strangely muffled, like the building itself had swallowed every outside sound. Lily hurried beside him, her shaky breath fogging up the entrance as she pushed the door open. Inside, the sterile scent of disinfectant drifted through the narrow hallway, mingling with soft beeps from distant exam rooms. The vet tech on duty, a young man named Evan, looked up in surprise the moment he saw the limp Malinois in Chris's arms. Whatever questions, he had slipped away when he noticed the dog's labored breathing. Evan quickly cleared a metal table, motioning for Chris to set Blaze down gently. The dog's paws barely touched the surface before another tremor rippled through him, his muscles tightening in sharp, desperate bursts. Lily reached for his muzzle, whispering steady encouragement, and Blaze leaned into her touch with what little strength he had left. Dr. Harlow, the night veterinarian, arrived moments later, her expression tightening the instant she saw Blaze's condition. She examined him with swift, practiced movements, her brow furrowing as she traced each scar, each patch of burned fur, each wound that shouldn't exist on an animal trained and cared for by professionals. When her gloved fingers reached the collar, her breath caught. She turned it slightly, revealing the harsh scratches on the inner band, numbers etched so violently they were nearly gouged into the material. Chris felt a cold weight settle in his chest as she whispered, "This wasn't done by accident. Someone wanted whatever was here erased." Blaze flinched when the scanner passed over his neck, the device beeping in uneven tones. The chip inside him sparked a faint response before fizzling into silence. Evan frowned, adjusting the settings. "It's been burned," he murmured, like someone tried to destroy the data without removing it entirely. Chris exhaled slowly, the truth beginning to settle into place. Blaze hadn't been lost. He hadn't been retired. Someone had silenced him. Lily's eyes widened with alarm, her hand tightening around Blaze's paw. "Who would do that?" she asked softly, her voice breaking as she looked at her father for answers he wasn't ready to give. Dr. Harlow lifted Blaze's hind leg carefully, revealing a fresh wound, deep, red, swollen, the skin irritated from prolonged rubbing. It wasn't from running or jumping. It was the mark of a restraint pulled tight for far too long. Blaze whimpered quietly, pressing his head into Lily's palm, seeking comfort from the smallest, gentlest presence in the room. As the vet cleaned the wounds, Blaze's body jerked suddenly, his breaths coming shallow and uneven. Evan grabbed a warm blanket, while Dr. Harlow attached an IV to the dog's front leg, moving with the urgency of someone who'd seen animals slip away in minutes. "He's in shock," she said quietly. "Whatever he's been through, it's been happening for months." Chris stepped back, leaning his hands on the counter behind him. Months. The same months Blaze was declared dead. The same months the federal task force had shut down communication about the warehouse explosion. His pulse tightened as pieces from the past began clicking into place, each one darker than the last. Evan hesitated before speaking again, his voice low. "A few weeks ago, 2 guys came in here asking if we'd treated a dog with injuries like these." He glanced toward Blaze, then toward Chris. "They looked official, but they weren't wearing badges. They just asked too many questions." The room felt suddenly colder. Lily moved her hand along Blaze's muzzle, her touch feather-light, and whispered, "You're safe now, buddy." Her voice carried a warmth nothing else in the room could offer. Blaze blinked once, slowly, as though holding onto her words. Chris watched the exchange, realizing Lily had become the anchor Blaze needed to stay connected to the world. The machines hummed softly as the IV dripped, steadying Blaze's breathing bit by bit. Dr. Harlow dimmed the overhead lights, giving the dog a softer glow to rest beneath. The frantic edge of the room slowly eased, replaced by a fragile stillness, one that felt like the thin line between danger and hope. Chris stood at the foot of the table, his eyes tracing the rhythm of Blaze's chest. There was still so much he didn't understand: the collar, the burned chip, the men who left Blaze chained in the square. But one thing had become painfully clear. Blaze hadn't just escaped something violent, he had survived it. And now that he was here, alive and trembling on a clinic table, the truth hiding under his skin was no longer buried. It was forcing its way to the surface, piece by piece, breath by fragile breath. The clinic had settled into a muted hush, the kind that comes only after panic has been wrung out of everyone in the room. Blaze lay curled beneath the warm blanket, his breath steadier but still fragile. Lily sat close enough that her knee brushed the edge of the table, her fingers tracing light circles along his muzzle to keep him grounded. Chris stood nearby, arms crossed tightly, watching the slow rise and fall of Blaze's chest. The faint rhythm gave him some relief, though the questions swirling in his mind refused to settle. The scratched collar, the burned chip, the wounds that didn't match anything a retired K-9 should ever endure. Every piece pointed toward something deliberate. The front door chimed softly, its tone thin and almost delicate, but the moment it sounded, Blaze's body stiffened beneath the blanket. His ears perked halfway, trembling violently as he forced himself upright despite the pain. Lily gasped, holding him steady, feeling his muscles coil with fear she had never seen in any animal before. Chris turned toward the entrance just as two men stepped inside. Their jackets were clean but unmarked, their shoulders squared too evenly to pass as casual visitors. They scanned the lobby first, then locked onto the hallway where Chris stood. Their eyes carried the cold efficiency of people who arrived with a purpose they didn't want questioned. The taller man stepped forward, flashing an ID that he didn't hold still long enough for anyone to read. "We're here for the dog," he said, his tone flat, rehearsed, as if recited many times before. "He belongs to federal custody. We'll take him from here." His gaze slid past Chris toward Blaze like the Malinois was a piece of property. Blaze tried pulling back, pressing himself against Lily like she could shield him from the men. His chest heaved with anxious breaths, and his injured leg tucked beneath him in a tight, protective curl. Lily wrapped both arms around him, whispering, "It's okay, buddy. I'm right. Here, I'm not letting them take you." Her voice shook but didn't waver. Chris stepped forward, blocking the hallway completely. "You're not taking him anywhere," he said calmly, though a fierce undercurrent ran through his words. "Not without paperwork, not without a warrant, and not while he's fighting for his life." The shorter agent stiffened, his jaw tightening with irritation he didn't bother to hide. Evan peeked out from the side room, sensing trouble. His eyes darted to Blaze, then toward the men with a mixture of confusion and worry. He edged closer to the alarm switch near the counter, keeping his movement discreet, as though he'd seen enough questionable people in his short career to read danger when it walked through the door. The taller agent moved another step closer, lowering his voice. "Deputy Walker, this dog was part of a federal operation. His transfer is classified. His condition is irrelevant to the chain of command." The way he said condition made Chris's stomach turn. The man wasn't here to help Blaze. He was here to remove a threat. Blaze trembled, lowering his head into Lily's lap as if bracing for something terrible. His breathing grew sharp and uneven again, but he refused to look away from the two men. Fear mixed with a faint spark of defiance, the remnants of a trained K-9 who once faced danger without hesitation, now fighting only to stay with the child who had offered him kindness. Before Chris could respond, the door swung open again. Marissa stepped through, her expression tense but resolute. She spotted the agents immediately and froze, her eyes narrowing in alarm. "You two weren't authorized to come here," she said sharply, the confidence in her voice cracking through the sterile room like glass under pressure. Both agents turned toward her, their faces shifting from annoyance to something darker. Recognition. Marissa took a slow breath and stepped forward, her gaze locked on the taller man. "Blaze isn't going anywhere," she said firmly. "Not with you. Not tonight." The room felt suddenly smaller, air tightening like stretched wire. Blaze lifted his head slightly at the sound of her voice. His ears twitched, uncertain, but he didn't lean toward her. He leaned toward Lily instead, nudging her gently with his nose, an unspoken plea to stay. Lily held him tighter, her eyes glistening as she whispered another promise to keep him safe. The agents exchanged a look that carried more meaning than words. Then, with a frustrated exhale, the taller one muttered, "This isn't over." They turned sharply and walked out the door, leaving a vacuum of tension in their wake. The clinic fell silent except for Blaze's trembling breaths and the faint hum of the overhead lights. As the SUV pulled away outside, Chris looked down at the Malinois curled against his daughter's lap. Blaze's body slowly relaxed again, exhaustion overtaking fear. Chris placed a hand gently on the dog's back, feeling the faint warmth beneath the blanket. Whatever had happened to Blaze wasn't just cruelty, it was part of something larger. And tonight, For the first time, it felt like that something had followed them straight to the clinic. The clinic lights dimmed to their late-night setting, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. Blaze lay wrapped in a warm blanket on the recovery mat, his breathing shallow but steadier than before. Lily stayed beside him, her hand resting softly on his paw, as if afraid moving it would make the rest of the night collapse again. Chris stood near the counter, shoulders tight, eyes fixed on the door that had just slammed shut a few minutes earlier. The agent's departure hadn't brought relief, it had only deepened the sense that they were standing on the edge of something far bigger than an injured K-9. Blaze's entire body reacted to danger before it arrived, and tonight had proven he was right too. Evan double-checked the lock on the back entrance, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't used to this kind of tension. Veterinary emergencies, yes, but not the kind of men who walked in wearing authority like armor and left the air feeling poisoned. He glanced at Blaze, then at Chris, as if searching for assurance that he hadn't imagined the threat. Marissa leaned against the far wall, her posture stiff with unresolved fear. She kept her eyes lowered, refusing to meet Chris's stare for more than a heartbeat. It wasn't guilt alone that held her there. It was the crushing weight of knowing she had helped build the situation, now unraveling in front of them. Blaze's fate had never been an accident. Blaze lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching at each creak in the building. Even weak, he scanned the room with the focus of a dog conditioned to recognize danger long before humans did. When he spotted Marissa, his muscles tightened. Not in aggression, but in the instinctive recoil of someone who had learned to fear the wrong hands. Chris approached her slowly, stopping just far enough to keep control if things escalated. "You need to tell me everything," he said quietly. "Right now." His voice was low but firm, the tone of a man who had spent his entire life reading lies the way others read expressions. Marissa lifted her gaze, and for the first time her composure cracked. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small flash drive, its edges worn from being handled too many times. "He wasn't supposed to survive the warehouse incident," she whispered. "Blaze detected something he shouldn't have. Something buried behind the crates that weren't on any of our records. Someone higher up panicked." Her breath trembled as she exhaled. Evan edged closer, listening despite himself. Lily continued stroking Blaze's fur, unaware that the truth spilling out behind her might shift everything her father believed about the badge he wore. Blaze watched. Marissa with tired focus, his breaths uneven, his spirit fighting to stay awake long enough to recognize the danger unfolding. Footsteps suddenly echoed outside the clinic, heavy and deliberate. Blaze stiffened immediately, a sharp tremor running along his spine. Chris moved to the window, lifting the corner of the curtain just enough to see outside. A dark figure paced near the parking lot, keeping just out of the light. The silhouette was too still, too intentional to be a passerby. Before anyone could react, the clinic's back door rattled violently, the handle jerking against Evan's lock. Lily gasped, and Blaze tried to rise, pushing against the blanket with desperate effort. His injured leg buckled, but he planted himself anyway, instinct forcing him to stand between Lily and the sound. Even broken, he refused to back down. Chris stepped between Blaze and the hallway, his hand hovering near his holster. "Evan," he said quietly. "Hit the alarm." Evan didn't hesitate this time. The moment his finger pressed the switch, a loud, piercing alert filled the clinic, echoing through every room. The figure outside bolted, footsteps fading into the parking lot's darkness. The alarm continued blaring until the clinic seemed to vibrate from the sound. Blaze's ears flattened, but he held his ground, leaning gently into Lily as though she were the only anchor he trusted. Chris finally shut off the alarm and turned to face the others, breath tight, body tense. "They weren't here for a dog," he said. "They were here to erase a loose end." Marissa closed her eyes, bracing against the truth she could no longer avoid. "They won't stop," she whispered. "Not until Blaze is gone." She looked at the Malinois with a mix of regret and resolve. He knows something they can't afford anyone to learn, and that makes him the most dangerous witness in the state. Still trembling, Blaze nudged his head beneath Lily's hand again. She gently cupped his muzzle, whispering, "You're safe. We'll keep you safe. I promise." Her small voice steadied the room more than the alarm ever could. Chris watched his daughter and the wounded dog, feeling something shift inside him, a vow taking shape. Tonight had proven that Blaze wasn't just a dog in danger. He was the key to unraveling a truth buried beneath lies, paperwork, and burned evidence. And now, with a child he trusted at his side, he wasn't facing it alone. Morning crept over Maple Ridge with a pale gold softness, the kind that made even the clinic's narrow windows glow. The alarm from the night before felt distant now, leaving only the residue of fear in the quiet halls. Blaze lay curled beneath a thicker blanket, his breath steadier, his body finally loosening from the tension he carried in every muscle. Lily had fallen asleep beside him, with her head resting gently near his shoulder, one small hand still tangled in his fur. Chris watched them from the doorway, the scene hitting him with a weight he didn't expect. In the middle of all the chaos, the child and the battered K-9 had formed a bond strong enough to hold them through the night. Dr. Harlow checked Blaze's vitals in calm, practiced motions. "He's stable," she murmured softly. "That's more than I expected after what he's endured." Blaze lifted his head at the sound of her voice, eyes faintly alert, but he didn't flinch, something he only did now with people who meant no harm. His gaze drifted back to Lily as though she were the only anchor he trusted. Marissa stepped into the room quietly, her expression carrying the weight of the truth she could no longer deny. She placed a small folder on the counter, documentation, statements, and the flash drive containing the evidence Blaze had uncovered. "Internal Affairs is taking the case," she said. "They have enough to open a full investigation." Chris nodded, though his jaw tightened. It wasn't triumph, just a long, heavy breath he had been holding for months. "And Blaze?" he asked. "Is he still considered evidence?" Marissa shook her head. "Not anymore. He's considered a witness, and he needs a protector, someone who won't hand him over to the wrong hands." Lily stirred awake, rubbing her eyes before looking down to see Blaze watching her. His tail thumped weakly, a soft tap against the blanket. She leaned closer, brushing her hand along his muzzle. "Hi, buddy," she whispered. "You scared me." Blaze responded by nudging her wrist, a gesture gentle enough to say more than words ever could. Chris crouched beside them, resting a hand lightly on Blaze's shoulder. The Malinois shifted toward him, slow but deliberate, recognizing not just a familiar scent, but a familiar loyalty. It was the first time since the park that he allowed himself to lean fully into Chris's touch, trusting him the way he once had before everything fell apart. The clinic door chimed softly again, but this time it wasn't a threat. The sheriff stepped in, hat in hand, offering Chris a brief nod. "IA is on their way," he said, "and there's protection ordered for you in the clinic until the investigation stabilizes." His eyes softened when he looked at Lily and Blaze. "Looks like he found his people?" Lily sat up a little taller, protective and certain in a way only a child could be. "Daddy?" she asked softly. "Can he come home with us now?" Chris felt the words hit him the same way they had in the square. But this time there was no fear, no hesitation. He met her gaze gently. "Sweetheart, you don't buy a dog like Blaze." For a moment her face fell, confusion spreading like a shadow. But Chris reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't buy heroes," he continued. "You protect them. If Blaze wants to stay, he stays." Lily turned to the dog in earnest, waiting for his answer with a heartbeat caught in her throat. Blaze pushed himself upright with effort, wobbling but determined. He stepped closer to Lily and rested his head against her chest, a clear, quiet choice made in the only language he'd ever needed. Lily wrapped her arms around him carefully, tears slipping down her cheeks as relief washed through her small frame. Outside, the sound of a distant engine rolled across the parking lot. Chris looked through the window to see a black SUV idling at the far end of the street. The same shape, the same stillness. But after a few seconds, the vehicle eased slowly away, disappearing into the waking town. For now, whatever threatened Blaze seemed to be retreating. The morning light grew brighter inside the room, warming the tiled floor and softening the tension that had lived in their shadows for so long. Blaze lay down again, resting his head in Lily's lap with a long, steady sigh, the kind a weary soul makes when he finally finds a place to come home to. And in that small clinic room, with sunlight spreading across the walls and danger drifting just beyond view, the wounded K-9 who had survived everything didn't feel alone anymore. He had chosen his family, and they had chosen him right back. If you made it this far, thank you. Stories like this stay with you, don't they? Before you go, tell me something simple in the comments. Type 1 if this story touched you. Type 0 if you want more stories like it. Your comment helps this little community grow, and if you don't want to miss the next story, hit subscribe. There are more powerful, heartwarming journeys on the way, and I'd be grateful to have you with us.